Hey guys, this is Argent Templar. So I was initially going to do this as like have some more visual stuff, maybe go on some different websites. The earlier version I recorded had that, but it kind of looked like shit, and Bandicam screwed up and double recorded my voice so it sounds echoey and just horrible. So now that I've kind of actually read this stuff and done one take of it, I'm just gonna talk, and I will show you some articles once we get to ISIS. So, what is this video about? As you may have guessed from the title, this is about the myth that terrorism and, in general, radical ideologues and socio-political revolutions are caused by deprivation, poverty, or more specifically, the working and agrarian peasant classes. This is always a narrative the left likes to push. I was listening to CFRB 1010, which, despite supposedly being a conservative radio station, is really, really left wing. And they were basically saying that, we have to address the root causes of ISIS. We have to deal with poverty and a lack of human rights in the Middle East and just stuff like that. Well, here's the thing about that. Poverty isn't the root of it. It's never been the root of it. It's hard to really think of a revolution as we understand the term that has been about poverty. Now, that's not to say there haven't been peasant revolts throughout history. Generally speaking, though, they tend to collapse pretty quick. They generally can't win because the peasants don't have the resources to win. They can't coordinate across the entirety of like a country. It might be a localized thing. It might even be a provincial thing. But the government can normally call in troops from the rest of the country to put them down. So I can't really think of a peasant revolt that succeeded. And generally speaking, if they do succeed, or I can't think of a case, but I seem to recall if they do succeed, they basically keep the existing system and just put someone more sympathetic to them in power. The lower classes of society tend to be much less ideological than the middle class and the upper class. And there's good reason for this. They have more worldly concerns. The lower class tends to have more children often. They have less money, so they're concerned with, well, putting food on the table, getting sleep when they can, working a couple jobs maybe, supporting their families. They don't have all the education and luxuries and ability to spend time reading and kind of contemplating the world that the middle class has. They just don't really have the education necessary to form these kind of ideas. I mean, does someone in Iraq or Palestine really, they're like, man, I can't get any food today. I'm gonna write this treatise on why we have to restore the caliphate, why we need to and then a bunch of shit like that, and then come up with some complicated historical religious explanation for why we need a global caliphate, and then decide, yes, we're gonna go and form an international terrorist organization and blow up France so I can get food. That's not how they think. They might go out and shoot someone to get food, but they just don't think that way. No, I mean, and as we'll see later once I get to the articles on this, revolution is a middle class pursuit. Virtually every revolution in history has been done by the middle class. Often the upper middle class, but yeah, very rarely is it by actually the nobility. If the nobility do get involved, it's normally things like the baronial revolts in Britain, where the nobility didn't really want to fundamentally change the system. They just wanted the system tweaked a bit to be more favorable to them and their interests. Generally speaking, the upper class has a vested interest in maintaining society as it is. They might sometimes opportunistically get on board, but as with the French Revolution, we'll get into this in a second, generally speaking, they aren't the ones who instigate it. They might join in, they might try to become a figurehead to save their necks later on, but they don't have a vested interest in overthrowing society because they're the ones who benefit the most for it. So let's just go through a couple different revolutions or revolutionary movements. So the first and kind of most notable revolution, particularly ideological revolution, is the French Revolution. The American Revolution I'm not as familiar with as the French. My understanding, though, is if you do look at guys like Paul Revere and Benjamin Franklin, a lot of the others, they tend to either be nouveau rich, like George Washington's family was not particularly wealthy. He was the richest president, but he made all his money through hard work and land speculation. He married into some of it. Most of, though, the revolutionary leaders were middle-class guys who had read all the stuff about classical liberalism and that kind of thing and wanted to implement it into America. Now, just keep in mind as I'm going through this, I'm going to be covering a lot of ground very quickly, and I won't really have time to go into everything in great detail. So just you can look this stuff up. More, it's just something to keep in mind. Whenever you're reading about a revolution, just look at what are the backgrounds of the people involved. They tend to be doctors, lawyers, low-ranking politicians, civil servants, university students, academics, that sort of thing. Maybe mid-ranking officers. These are all positions that are they have some influence in society, but they aren't really the dominant political class. So the French Revolution was pretty much entirely a movement of the bourgeoisie, or the new urban middle class. If you look, if anything, the French Revolution, its main cause was the emergence of a modern middle class. The old nobility was becoming substantially less wealthy than a new generation of merchants, lawyers, philosophers, etc. And given that this new emerging middle class demanded rights, demanded more political representation. They also kind of embraced new ideologies. Classical liberalism is in essence kind of a theory of empowerment of the middle classes, because it sought to rearrange society along the lines of wealth and merit as opposed to blood and tradition. Now that's a gross oversimplification, of course, but just think about it. Just kind of look at who the classical liberal thinkers were. Look at what their position was like in society. People like Rousseau, people like John Locke, people like Thomas Hobbes. These people were not, for the most part, poor, but nor were they kind of the aristocratic elite who ran society. Most liberal thinkers tended to be middle or upper middle class. So, we have the French Revolution, where we have people like Robespierre. The Jacobins are pretty much synonymous with kind of middle-class revolutionary principles. They implemented kind of the reign of terror in an attempt to bring their kind of utopia on Earth. And ultimately, and their radicalism was kind of countered by somewhat more conservative movements like the Thermodites and the Directorate, who were much less middle class and much less idealistic in character. Eventually, the revolutionary period kind of comes to an end when they get Napoleon, who's kind of interesting because he's kind of he's a poor noble, so he's kind of straddling the line. But once again, I think the lesson we take away from the French Revolution, and from most revolutions, is the middle class is inherently revolutionary, because they, well, of course, they have the education and time and comforts normally to pursue an education, to think about these issues, but also their position in society is often precarious. It's very often, if there's a slight change in economic circumstances, they can find themselves losing their money. Because the middle class is normally, a lot of their net worth is in the form of cash or investments, etc. The upper class tends to own things like jewels, gold, land, buildings, that kind of thing. Stuff that doesn't really matter nearly as much how the economy is doing. Like if you own the Empire State Building, that's a pretty safe investment. That'll always be worth something. It'll always probably be worth a lot of money. Whereas if you have something like the financial crisis, Your pension fund can disappear and you lose everything. So there's that inherent instability, which paradoxically kind of comes with middle class wealth. There's also having a bit of power, but not enough power. Kind of getting a taste of the good life, a taste of some influence of society, but not having enough to really remake it. And kind of the frustration associated with that. Kind of a feeling of ineffectualness, but having like a bit of power. I mean, the poor are generally speaking often so poor and just so kind of irrelevant that people don't really even consider them, and they don't really consider seizing power for themselves because they lack the resources or the organization to do so. However, a better educated middle class, which is much larger in size, much better coordinated, and while lacking the extreme resources of the wealthy, do have resources of their own and talents and skills of their own that would be productive to a revolution. They're in a good position to overrun the upper class. And then, as Marx would say, make themselves the upper class. And that's kind of how I find revolutions tend to work. They tend to be the product of an ideology from the middle class, which aims to displace some sort of ruling class and establish a new society where they have power, but also, generally speaking, with a very kind of romantic ideological bent to it. So we also see this during the I forget what the name of it was. There was that riot, that revolution attempt that they portrayed in Les Mis, in which a bunch of students attempted a coup against the July monarchy, or the Orleanist. Let me just check this. Sorry, June Rebellion is what it was called. Where a group of university students attempted to overthrow the constitutional monarchy and replace it with a more radical republic. In fact, the Orleanist faction, or the July monarchy, was a kind of a middle class form of monarchy, which had replaced the restored rule of the Legitimists and the Bourbons. So generally speaking, like even just looking at France, and we're going to look at a couple other countries, we had the French Revolution. We had the change from the Legitimists to the Orleanist constitutional monarchy, and then we had an attempt to overthrow the Orleanist monarchy by university students and go back to being kind of a radical republic. And we see this as kind of a reoccurring theme through France that continues on for a long time. These movements are all kind of middle class in nature, often upper middle class. So from here we go on to Germany and the revolutions of 1948. Now the revolutions of 1948, or the Springtime of Nations, was a massive surge of liberalism and nationalism that took hold across of Europe. There was kind of a feeling, to a large extent, that the various ethnicities and nationalities had been betrayed by monarchs who were only interested in personal unions and viewing the nation as their private plaything, kind of. Like for instance, it was kind of about borders not reflecting ethnicities, but not really being annexed. So we had kind of like the scenario in Austro-Hungary, where the Austrian emperor was the king of both Hungary and Austria, and was the king of all these other various peoples and stuff. And this was more kind of due to an old form of feudalism, rather than any real form of kind of a national empire. Like the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not a German empire in the way the German Empire was. It was not a dominant ethnicity that enforced its rule over the others. It was kind of a confederation of unrelated peoples. So there's a lot of tension around that. There was a demand for, I guess just a general feeling that the current ruling class was disinterested in the needs of the nation, and very often kind of reactionary forces during this time period viewed nationalism as a threat to their position and a threat to kind of order, and they often very much opposed it. Some governments eventually came to embrace it, such as the Russian and German governments, but a lot of them attempted to repress nationalism. The nationalists and liberals from this period were both middle class in nature. Eventually, a lot of working class people would join in with the springtime of nations, would become embroiled in kind of the attempts to kind of overthrow the old monarchies and replace them with kind of modern nationalistic liberal democracies. They were very much led by the middle class, and eventually a split between them led to the collapse and the defeat by them by reactionary forces. The stage was set, though, and over the next 50 or so years, many monarchies fell or gradually lost the amount of power they had over society. Going back to Germany, at the end of World War I, we have the German Revolution, in which communists briefly seized power. I believe one of the revolutionary leaders, who was a Jewish communist, go figure, referred to it as a middle-class revolution that unified the working and bourgeoisie classes to overthrow the old feudalism. If you look at most of the figures that participated in the German Revolution, most of them tend to be middle-class socialists or middle-class radicals. Similarly, and I believe the link will be in the video description, if we look at the Nazi Party, fascism was to a large extent a middle-class ideology. Certainly, if you look at, and I'm not saying that this is reliable because they tend to lie, but the Marxist narrative was that fascism was bourgeoisie socialism. That is, it was middle-class socialism. It was an ideology created by the middle class to prevent social revolution. I think there is some truth to that. I think the middle class became extremely worried about socialism and kind of social liberalism and just kind of the spread of that and the internationalism that followed World War I. And then once again, this is an oversimplification, of course, but we're just trying to do an overview here. And kind of fascism was the response to that. If we look at Nazi Germany, I believe it was like 80% of the middle class, or some absurdly high number, who voted for Hitler. Fascism in Brazil, integralism, was explicitly a middle class movement and had a lot of support from mid-level officers in the army and Brazilian Navy. I believe it was similar in Italy. I know a lot of particularly like Jewish businessmen, because they were Ashkenazi Jews, and Ashkenazi Jews tend to be more conservative. Sorry, Sephardic Jews, because Sephardic Jews tend to be more conservative. A lot of Sephardic Jews were fully on board and liked the fascist party in Italy. If we look at the Russian Revolution, most of the leadership, although it was more working class than others, most leadership of the Russian Revolution were guys like Lenin, who were like kind of intellectuals. They weren't nobility, they weren't generals, but they were fairly important, enough to have a bit of money and some education. If we look at the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Party was started by kind of intellectuals in Shanghai, and it was eventually taken over by Mao Zedong. Now, Mao Zedong's family was not particularly wealthy. He was rather poor, but he was educated. He was a librarian and a school teacher, which is pretty much the closest thing you get to kind of a middle-class guy in China during that period. Gandhi's kind of another revolutionary figure. He was a lawyer, so he's another kind of middle-class guy. And you could just go down the list. Castro was a lawyer. Che Guevara was a doctor. Once again, these positions may carry some wealth with them, but they don't carry kind of the dominating political influence or power that someone like Donald Trump would have, that Steve Jobs would have, that Bill Gates would have, that just some of the, like Ted Turner, Mark Zuckerberg. These people are the true upper class. They wield so much more power and money that any number of doctors seem insignificant compared to them. When you think of the upper class, you really have to think big. I kind of think of doctors as being upper middle class, depending on their position. Maybe if they like administer a hospital, or they're like president of a medical association or something, then they're upper class. But generally speaking, the difference between the upper middle class and upper class is access to political power. Going to the Middle East, and I will do 5 more minutes, then we'll get to the actual ISIS stuff. If we look at Turkey, the Young Turks, were a group of middle-class university students. A lot of the Young Turks were medical students. A lot of the Young Turks were middle-class people who were disenfranchised with the decline of Ottoman power. Many of them had been educated in the West, and they had subscribed to ideas of rationalism, modernism, liberalism, secularism, and nationalism. And they formed the Committee of Union and Progress. The Committee of Union and Progress, kind of a strangely worded title, which was a nationalist liberal party that also kind of wanted to create a scientific dictatorship in Turkey. So very much kind of like a middle class ideology centered one, and it was widely supported by what little Turkish middle class was. And they eventually kind of started to adopt kind of pseudoscientific theories, and they tried to revolutionize the Turkish state. They introduced a constitution. They added racial policies to the Turkish state, and they began exterminating minorities to try to create a homogenous Turkey, kind of echoing what the Shoah would be like in a couple decades. Actually, the Turks probably killed more people, or at least relatively more people, considering the size of the populations they were exterminating. So that was another kind of middle-class revolutionary movement. Ataturk was, I'm not sure his exact position, but I believe he was like a moderately low-ranking officer who rose through the ranks. And he kind of came from a similar place as the Young Turks, but he was kind of more, I guess you could say, more nationalistic and less left-winged. Finally, to conclude with, before we get to ISIS, the Ba'ath movement, which famously Assad, Saddam Hussein, those people were members of, was founded primarily by middle-class Arabs as a reflection of their idealism of pan-Arabism. The idea that all the Arab states should be united in kind of a socialist grand Arab republic. So the Ba'ath parties were often called the pan-Arab socialist Ba'ath parties. And this was based on kind of intellectuals who had studied fascism. It did have Islam as part of its ideology, but it was not as explicitly Islamic. It was more secular. It was more nationalistic to within the country, and to a larger extent kind of pan-nationalist. They kind of came up with these elaborate historical theories, like Iraq is a reincarnation of Babylon, or things like this. You can look into Baathism yourself. Once again, the links will all be included. Just click on them and search middle class, and they will pop up in most of these. So now we're getting into ISIS. So Al-Qaeda was largely a middle-class movement. Obviously, Osama bin Laden is upper class. But if we look at kind of where they come from, the ideological grandfather of the Al-Qaeda was Sayyid Qutb, who was a Egyptian school teacher. If you watch the BBC documentary The Power of Nightmares, they talk extensively about him. Sayyid Qutb wrote a number of books espousing Islamism as a way to stop degeneracy and cultural decline. And he eventually kind of became the founding figure. I'm not sure if he was the actual founder or just kind of the ideological basis, but close enough, of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, if you want to look it up, is a middle-class association. I will post a link to that as well, and you can just Google it. But the Muslim Brotherhood actually controls most of the professional associations in Egypt. So Islamic fundamentalism is not really that much of an ideology of the lower classes. It's much more kind of this middle class, educated, idealistic kind of utopian idea. The lower classes of society tend to have other things to worry about. They're more interested in when they get their next meal, not in establishing a global caliphate. So the Muslim Bros split, and Al-Qaeda kind of came out of that in a combination with some Saudis and some Mujahideen. And they, if you look at Al-Qaeda, they're mostly middle class too. And this is where we get to ISIS. So we're just going to look at a couple articles real quick and finish off. So what is Islamic terrorism like? So here's an article in the Daily Telegraph. Doctors are behind this failed bomb attack. Bomb attacks, at least in the West, are beginning to follow a set template. As the name of terrorists leak out, friends and neighbors react with shocked disbelief. More often than not, the terrorists were reasonably educated. The NHS cell members in this regard are a little different from the tube bombers of 2 years ago. For the next few days, newspapers run contradictory comment pieces. On one hand, wondering how a teacher, doctor, grammar school boy could have gotten caught up with the jihadist, and on the other, complaining about the alienation of immigrant communities. Alienation, poverty, despair, terrorism has always been a middle-class pursuit. Yet you get the odd oaf Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, for example, but most Islamist murderers approximate the profile of terrorists through the ages. Youngish male, fairly bright, introverted, unsuccessful with women, contemptuous of the bourgeoisie society from which they have sprung, or in other words, kind of archetypical middle class. Osama bin Laden's followers are not so different in this regard from the Red Brigades or the Baader-Meinhof game. Let's see here. They see pictures of bin Laden with his beard and whatever and imagine they are fighting for return to the desert. But the more telling photograph is of a teenage Osama in flares leaning against his father's pink Cadillac. He is seen as essentially Western terrorist. A revolutionary, not a conservative. Let's see here. The natural adherence of such doctrines, attracts the kind of disaffected young men who in different circumstances might have turned to other revolutionary creeds. Jacobinism, fascism, communism. To put it another way, Islamism is simply the latest in a long line of isms which purport to wipe the state clean and start again. The natural adherents of such doctrines are middle-class youth with just enough dedication to be seeking an ideological validation for their violent impulses. Radical imams offer them such validation. The reason you feel so angry, they tell their charges, is not that something wrong with you, but there's something wrong with everyone else. You see the truth. Your aggression is not a shameful emotion, but a noble one. This is so this is very much So here's just another brief thing. More than 60% of terrorist suspects are well educated and from comfortable backgrounds. 90% of them are categorized as being sociable and having a large number of friends. So here we see he makes the case pretty well here. In short, terrorism is a middle-class, well-educated phenomenon. It doesn't appeal to the lower classes. It's never appealed to the lower classes. Islamism, like all of the revolutionary ideologies throughout history, including my own, evidently. I'm not denying it. I'm just making a point. I'm not saying whether any of these things are really good or bad. It's more just kind of an observation and debunking the narrative. I don't really review fascism, at least the non-German forms, as a bad thing. But they were middle class or bourgeoisie in nature. I don't think there's any real doubting of that. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matter. I'll post this with all the other stuff. This is Argent Templar signing out.